Christi, we are so excited to have you here today. You're a big part of our church. You serve on multiple teams. But today we wanted to dive into your victory story. So thank you for being here to share that.
Of course.
So before we dive into your victory story, could you share a little bit of your upbringing and your faith upbringing as well?
So I have probably a very unique story. My dad was raised in the Greek Orthodox Church, and my mom was Italian Catholic. So I can only really kind of speculate that they had a lot of religion kind of shoved into them. So when my folks did get married, they did get married in a Greek Orthodox church, and then they came to the United States by where my grandparents immigrated from Italy to Daytona Beach, Florida area. So I really don't know what they kind of did for their faith, when they first got married. But then when they did have my brother, he was baptized in a Greek Orthodox church. I was born 2 years later, but my parents just solo with my brother moved up to Central Illinois. So I was also baptized in a Greek Orthodox church. And really the only reason I know that is because of the pictures. It's a very, very elaborate, I guess you could say, event. Well, after that, really religion was never kind of, I guess, I don't want to say it like enforced, but was really encouraged with my brother and I. But I do know that when I would visit my family in Florida, they were very devout Catholics, and they would take me to church with them, and it was just a different kind of experience. And I remember, though, my mom's first cousin saying, "We don't know why Anna doesn't take you to church." That was my mom's name. And I just never really, questioned it until I was probably about middle school age. My brother's only a couple years older than me. He was getting into a little bit of trouble, and I think my mom realized, like, we needed something, in our lives. She was just, and again, I can only speculate because she has passed away, that I think she was intimidated by, there was one Catholic church in my hometown. I grew up in a very small, farm town, and she really didn't want anything to do with it. So she ended up taking us to a Lutheran church where one of our neighbors went to. So my brother and I were somewhat fast-tracked to receive communion. We also did confirmation, and we did go to church, and we did participate there. But probably once I hit high school, we did more, I guess you could say, like the Sunday school, but for high schoolers. And then went to, church services on Christmas and Easter and special occasions. But then once I graduated high school, I did have somewhat of a falling out with my folks, and I just never really returned to church. I just did not feel, I guess, that connected, and just kind of went on my own direction. So,
Did you ever feel spiritually hungry? I guess, interested in learning more about religion or God?
I was and I wasn't. I think because I probably just grew up in a very dysfunctional family, and I was probably more angry with God of why, because my mom had very harsh mental health, bipolar manic depression that was very, very trying on our family, where it was a lot. So I think more times I had to be the mom in situations. So I think I was more mad of why was I given these parents? And then I had a very strict Greek father where he was you didn't toe the line with him. He was very strict, and you always just kind of obeyed his rules. So I was probably more why God? Why do I have this kind of family, and why is my mom always in and out of hospitals and that? So, but I knew there was just still, though, something more that I thought I need more in my life. I think I'm more for, there's more for me out there than this life that I'm living, right now. And that was probably one of the reasons why I wanted to get out of my hometown, so bad. So.
When I think about you, Christi, I see you smiling all the time. I see you having a very uplifting spirit here at church. And a lot of the times when you see someone smiling, you don't always see their full story of the things they went through. You went through something very difficult in a relationship, in a season that was very difficult. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So just a little bit more background. I did end up going to college and ended up getting a degree in occupational health and safety. And with my jobs, one of them took me where I was on the road. But even, during that time, I would say my moral compass wasn't probably always, pointing due north. And I was probably somewhat reckless when it came to relationships and with men. And I got to a point where I'm I'm done. And unfortunately, I was always kind of dating guys with work. I've always worked in the construction industry. I've lived so much on those job sites. And so that's where you meet guys. And so I kind of came to a point, I was probably in my mid-30s, I would say, and I was like, I'm done. You know what I mean? I'm done dating guys at work. I'm just kind of done with this, with what's going on. And then I met Gary, and he was actually like my boss, and I probably shouldn't have gone into those boundaries, but we were, I guess you could say, like best friends for a while. And then it was just like one night, it was just like, I knew I just fell for him, and just, vice versa. And I was in that, I guess you could say, part of my life where it's like you work hard, you play hard, and now I have this like, great relationship where, this man loves me. And I was in such a, that time I thought I was like, I'm such a good place. Like I got good things going on for me. So.
Was faith a part of your life at that point at all?
It really wasn't, but Gary always wore a cross. And he was raised Catholic. His mom was a devout Catholic. And there would be times, though, that he would share with me, like he worked in Alaska at one time. And he just, I remember him telling me the story about how he just kind of kicked back and he just looked at the beautiful, like nature. And he was like, God, you did good. So he, spoke of God, not I don't want to say quite often, but, there was times. But also, too, our lifestyle on these job sites that we worked on, we sometimes worked like 7 days a week, 14-hour days, 12-hour days. There really wasn't much more, you know what I mean, like outside of, I guess you could say, our work life. So that's why if you did have time off, you played hard. So probably a little times God was kind of in the background.
So as that relationship goes on, can you talk a little bit about what ended up happening?
So, yes. So like I said, things were going really good. We were planning our future, talking about marriage. He even bought me a ring, like a promise ring, or eventually, to be an engagement ring. And one day he went his way to work, I went my way to work. Touched base a couple times, through texting and that, maybe a phone call here and there. And when I got back to where I was staying at, we were in like central Indiana, nowhere, cornfields of Indiana. And he wasn't home from work. And I was just kind of concerned, and I can't explain it, but I just had this feeling there was something wrong. And I kept calling, I kept texting, and I was getting no response. And it had probably been about a couple hours. And I'm like, something's not right, something's wrong. And I then reached out to a couple of guys at work. And by the way, we try to keep our relationship a secret. I did find out later on, a lot of guys were like, we kind of knew something, what's going on. But I reached out to a couple guys and I'm like, have you heard from Gary? And they're like, you know what? I did send him a text early. I never heard anything. And that's when I was like, he never answers his work calls or gets back to one of the guys. And I just was pacing and pacing. And I was almost about ready to jump in my vehicle and start driving around just to see like what was up. Not too long after that, I had a knock on the door, and it was a sheriff and what I didn't know at the time, a county coroner, who asked me if I knew him and that he was in a car accident. And when the coroner introduced himself, I lost it. I'm like, you can't be here, because then I know what that means. He didn't make it. And they said, no, he didn't. And I dropped to the ground, and I remember another coworker, because we all kind of like lived near each other, and a lot of them had travel trailers and that. And I screamed for him and told him what happened, and we just hugged each other, and I just was like, this is not happening. This is not real. And we got some of the guys together, and we were talking about what was happening. And I can't remember if it was the coroner or if it was the sheriff, but someone said, would someone like to talk to a chaplain? And now I know it was the Holy Spirit talking through me, but at that time I didn't know. And I just raised my hand and I said, I want to. And they called a chaplain. He was there pretty quickly. And I remember I was like, guys, I need to be alone. And I talked to this man, and I was like, a lot of these guys just know our relationship as work, but they know he and I were super close. I said, but he was the love of my life. And I said, I can't do this. I can't live life without him. And this chaplain just talked with me. And this happened to be Maundy, Thursday when this happened. I had no idea what Maundy, Thursday was. And he said, Easter's on Sunday. He goes, I would really like you to come to my church. And I said, you know what? I think I need to come to church. And it was a non-denominational church, again, out in the middle of a cornfield, nowhere. I went, and he immediately approached me and introduced me to some ladies there. And I can't explain the feeling, but it was just comforting, but yet still scary, and yet just unknown. But I cried almost that whole church service, and I just was like, I need this. I need the lights. I need to go to God. Because in all honesty, times before, if I was during dark times with my folks or hard times, I went to alcohol. I went to, dark places, and I'm like, I can't do that. I can't anymore. So that was my first experience, and I just was like, this is something for me. This is what I have to go for.
What are some conversations that you had with God after feeling that kind of hurt?
Oh my gosh, that night I was so mad. And I remember just screaming at God when I was finally by myself that night. And I remember like negotiating. Like I was like, you could take my arm away. You could, paralyze me if you could just bring him back, or you could bring him back at a capacity that we don't have to be in a relationship, just just have him back in my life. But that also too was a moment for me of reckoning of like, God, I believe you and I need you. Like I was just screaming, at and just wanting to make anything happen to bring him back.
How long ago did that happen?
9 years ago.
Wow. So since that 9-year period, what started to happen with your faith over that time period?
So this is what's funny was I ended up moving to a different job site because I couldn't be on that same job site anymore. It was just very, very hard and a lot of changes. But I just moved down to the road to another job site. And I remember telling the guys there, because again, we were working 7 days a week. And I'm like, I have to go to church on Sunday. And I didn't even have really probably appropriate church clothes, what I would consider. But I'm like, I will be back on the job site, but I have to go to church. So I ended up going to that non-denominational church for a little while. And then it was the summertime, and my company was very comforting and very accommodating. I took some time off in the summer to get my bearings, and they said, if you don't want to go back to Indiana, you don't. And they made room for me at a job in Illinois and Missouri. So I just kind of jumped back into, the work life and just was trying to figure some life out. And no matter what in my life, I've always thought about giving back more like at Christmas time or Thanksgiving time. That was just kind of always a part of, what I did. And I know the year before, I can't remember exactly what happened, but the place that I gave to, it just didn't work out well. So I just remember I was a real lost sheep. And my friend Becky, she was like, my boss Jeff goes to this church that he talks about all the time. And I think they do something at Christmas. I know you need to get back into, doing something where you're giving. And because she always saw that I liked, doing those things, whether it be for a senior center or like for kiddos or something. And I was like, what, maybe that's a good idea. So I'm like, can you ask Jeff what's the church information? And she did. And it was Victory of the Lamb. And I remember calling and I talked to Pastor Bill and I was like, hi, I'm Christi. And I go, my friend Becky, her boss Jeff goes to church there. They referred that maybe you do a toy drive or something for Christmas. And Pastor Bill was just so nice on the phone. And he was like, yes, we do. And he goes, why don't you bring the gifts on Sunday, such and such, as when we're donating, like at 8:45. So like right before, I think it was very strategic, right before the 9 o'clock service. And I was like, okay, so I did my usual like shopping, wrapped the gifts and that. And it was just so amazing to pull into the parking lot here. And I think I opened the back of my SUV and Pastor Bill, and at the time it was Pastor Ben Kurth, just walked up to me. And when Pastor Bill goes, you must be Christi. And I was kind of taken aback, like, you remember my name? And then they're like, let us help you. You know what I mean? Bring these gifts in. And I just walked in and Pastor Bill goes, why don't you stay for church service? And the first person he introduced me to was Patty and said, you can sit with Patty. And she was like, absolutely.
Thinking back to who you were in that moment when you had lost your spouse and looking at today, where do you see God in that entire journey?
So now that it's like 9 years, I mean, I'm in such a good place. And at that time, like I said, I had such anger and I didn't, really understand that God has a plan. It's not always going to poof, this is why I'm doing this for you. Like it's an instant, like, this is why this happened to you. But I know that God put him in my life because I was so reckless when it came to men and relationships that he calmed me and he treated me like a true lady and made me feel beautiful, like inside and out, that I am worthy of having that good in my life and having a good relationship and that, but also too, he took him out of my life to save me. I mean, by losing Gary, it actually saved me because I came to God and my spiritual health is so much better. And I am going to go to heaven and be there when we're like made new again. And if I wouldn't have lost him, I probably wouldn't have gone down, that road and gone through what I've gone through and learning to trust God's plan. And I think that's what it has a lot to do with. At times in those struggles and those storms, we don't have to always understand. And we might not even understand it until we get to heaven and we're there with Jesus and, knowing we went through those things. But it just comes down to ultimately, we just have to trust that plan. And it might take years to even realize, why that happened to you, whether it be a loss, an illness, anything like that, but we just have to trust.
What piece of advice would you have to give to somebody that maybe is going through that grief or loss right now?
I would say that it is so okay to have all those emotions, and it's okay to be mad, and it's okay to yell and vent, and God has the shoulders, to handle that anger and whatever feelings. But then what you do with that afterwards is the most important thing. You don't want to take that anger to the next level of maybe violence or doing, self-harm or, harming somebody else because of that anger, where I think you just have to take that. And as long as it takes you to grieve and in the way that you have to grieve, but then take it and make it into something positive. Or if it is a loss, do something that you're like, that person is going to be proud of me with what I've done with like my life and that. And just be patient because like I said, it might take a while to realize this is why things are happening. So.
Is there a Bible verse that you carried with you throughout these years or even today that carries you through harder times?
So yeah, it was probably a few years ago where there was one of the sermons and it was Romans chapter 5 and it's verses like 3-4. I don't know the exact, I'm not great because there's so many different versions, of the Bible, but ultimately it's about suffering, where suffering leads to perseverance and then perseverance leads to hope. And that's where I'm at, is I have so much like hope, for my future and that.
Awesome. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with people about your story or getting them through those hard times?
So, and it's maybe not just always like through like the hard times, but it doesn't matter where you're at in your life. Like I said, I didn't come back to true, Christianity until I was about like 39. So it's never too late. And it doesn't matter, again, like I said, there was times in my life that like, I'm like, yep, I'm going to hell. I'm going to hell. And you're with your friends, you goof around about it. You think it's, it's kind of, type silly things and that. But again, as long as you ask for that forgiveness, you believe in Jesus, you have, our Savior came, he died, he rose for us. You don't have to feel like I have to jump through this hoop or do this or do that, but also too, like God's grace and mercy. And it doesn't matter where you're at, in your life or what you're struggling through, or if you step away and come back. Like I said, I was that lost sheep for many, many years and had no idea, but I know God was always by my side. And sometimes I go back in my past realizing, yep, he was there to help me, get through there. So where I'm at right now, and you just, like I said, have to take whatever that is and turn it into, something like positive. So don't, even if you fall off the tracks, you can get back on. It doesn't matter what's going on or
Amen.
where you're at.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking time today to share your story. We're so blessed to have you here at Victory.
Oh, thank you. Like I said, I really love being a part of the Victory family.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Part of the Journey. Christi mentioned a passage from Romans chapter 5 that I'd like to share with you. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Like Christi mentioned, we may not realize in the moment why we go through things like grief and pain, but God has plans laid out for us that when we look back, we can understand why we went through some of those things. And so it's important that even when we are facing times of suffering, we have that hope that Jesus can give, that he works all things for our good. That's all for this episode of Part of the Journey. Be sure to like and subscribe so that you'll be notified when our next episode drops.